Usually when we talk about science, especially when we're trying to figure out something really complex, like, say, a medical diagnosis, there's just this overarching expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely. We want it to be exact.
Right. It's supposed to feel like engineering. I mean, you fall off your bike, you break your arm, and the X-ray just shows that jagged white line on a black background.
Yeah, and the doctor points to it and says, well, there it is.
Exactly. It's binary. It's either broken or it's not broken. And honestly, there's something incredibly comforting about that.
For sure. I mean, we fundamentally want the universe to be visible.
Measurable, right. And easily sorted into little boxes that we can actually comprehend.
We crave that certainty.
We really do. But today, for all of you listening who love to learn and are always looking for those aha moments, we're going to look at a text that takes that metaphorical X-ray machine and, well, kind of just shatters it.
It really does. It completely upends that whole paradigm.
It totally does. So we are taking a deep dive into this fascinating book published back in 1913 by Besant. It's titled Evolution and Occultism.
A very heavy title, but so incredibly rich.
Seriously. And our mission today for this deep dive is to explore a timeline, basically tracing from ancient mystical theories of human development to what was considered, cutting-edge modern science at the turn of the 20th century.
And the contrast there is just staggering.
It is. We're going to compare these two vastly different viewpoints on how humanity actually came to be. We'll correct some popular scientific misconceptions of that era and really try to understand evolution not just as a biological process, but as something deeply esoteric.
And it's a phenomenal text to unpack precisely because of the era it comes from,
Right, 1913.
Yeah, but even before that, this book is actually a collection of essays and addresses. Some of them date all the way back to the Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893.
Wow, 1893, that's setting quite a stage.
Exactly. So you have to picture the historical context for a second. This is a moment in time when ancient esoteric thought was just crashing head-on into the rapidly advancing science of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Science that was becoming heavily instrumented and, honestly, very confident in itself.
Very confident. And to really set the stage for how Besant tackles this massive collision, we kind of have to grasp the core premise she lays out right at the very beginning.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, it is a complete paradigm shift regarding how we view the origins of life. Because in our standard Western view, we're taught that evolution is a story that basically starts in the mud.
The primordial soup.
Right. Dead matter somehow, miraculously, sparks into life, and then that single-celled biological life struggles to survive.
It adapts to its environment, right?
Exactly. And eventually, over millions and millions of years, it produces a mind.
Right. I mean, that's the classic survival of the fittest narrative. We go from the amoeba to the fish to the ape and finally to the human.
The standard textbook timeline.
Exactly. It's a purely upward trajectory, basically building complexity out of essentially nothing but time and random mutation.
But this text posits something totally different. It argues that this upward climb we call evolution is actually only half of a much larger circle.
Wait, only half?
Just half. And she argues that this upward climb is a completely unintelligible mystery if you don't understand the first half of the circle.
Okay, so what's the first half?
That first half is a concept known in esoteric philosophy as involution.
Involution. Okay, I'm trying to picture this. If evolution is the slow climb upward from matter to mind, involution sounds like, I don't know, playing that tape in reverse.
Sort of, yeah.
Is she arguing that we started as minds and then devolved into matter?
Well, not devolved exactly, because devolution implies a failure, or some kind of regression.
Right, like a step backwards.
Exactly. Involution, at least in this context, is described as the absolute source and fount of life. It's this deliberate, intentional concept of spirit, or the divine, or the all-consciousness, whatever you want to call it, involving itself in matter.
Involving himself.
Yes. It is spirit descending into the densest possible forms, like reaching its absolute lowest, most restrictive point in the mineral kingdom.
Oh, wow. So literally starting in the rocks.
Basically, yes. And only after it has fully anchored itself in that really dense matter does it turn around and begin the long climb upwards.
That is wild.
So the argument is that before physical forms could ever evolve upward to become more complex, the life energy, the spirit itself, had to dive down into matter.
Just to give it that initial push.
Exactly, to give it the initial impulse to grow.
I mean, that completely flips the entire biological narrative on its head. It means that it isn't dead matter just accidentally becoming alive because lightning struck a puddle.
Right, no random accidents here.
It means life itself, like spirit, intentionally put on the heavy, restrictive clothing of matter. It's like, oh, it's like a deep-sea diver.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like a diver putting on a heavy lead-lined suit just to be able to reach the ocean floor. But with the ultimate goal of eventually molding that heavy suit into a perfect expression of the diver inside.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. I mean, it completely elevates evolution from just a blind biological process to an actual cosmic drama.
A cosmic drama, I love that phrasing.
And under this framework, the evolution we observe under microscopes, the building of the body, the nervous system, the brain, is, according to this text, just the spirit striving back upward.
Pushing from the inside.
Exactly. It's pushing from within, trying to expand its expression through increasingly complex physical forms. It is very much an inside-out process, not an outside-in process.
Okay, so if we're going to truly understand how humanity arrived at these two incredibly different conclusions, the standard upward biological climb versus this cyclical spiritual evolution model, we really have to look at how humanity has studied life throughout history.
We do, and Besant draws a massive, unmistakable dividing line in the text here.
Right, between what she calls ancient science and modern science.
Yes, and she traces the genealogy of these two sciences back to their geographical and historical roots.
And the historical tracing she does is just fascinating, especially regarding what she terms ancient science. Because she doesn't just start with the Greeks, right? Or early recorded history.
No, not at all. She points way back to the lost continent of Atlantis. Specifically, she mentions the island of Poseidonis, which is actually the exact same island Plato famously wrote about disappearing beneath the waves some 11,000 years ago.
See, that detail alone tells you we are definitely not in a standard biology textbook anymore.
Not even close.
She grounds this ancient scientific tradition in a literally sunken past. It suggests this lineage of knowledge that survives massive cataclysms. And then she traces the remnants of this occult ancient science to the records of Egypt.
She does, and she includes a really compelling linguistic note there, which I found fascinating. The text points out that the very word chemistry derives its name from chem.
Chem, which was the ancient name for Egypt.
Exactly. It implies that the absolute deepest roots of our material sciences are embedded in these ancient, deeply mystical cultures.
Right, but she argues that this ancient science, after being brought eastwards, truly took root and flourished in India.
Yes, it was carried to what she calls a magnificent height by the Aryan stock, becoming the absolute archetype of how ancient science was conducted.
Okay, let's unpack this. If India is the archetype for this ancient science, how did they actually operate? I mean, they weren't building large hadron colliders or using electron microscopes back then.
Definitely no electron microscopes.
So the text makes a massive point about their foundational philosophy being entirely deductive.
Deductive, that's the key word.
Right. They didn't start by looking at a rock or a leaf. They studied the life principles first.
Exactly. They began with psychology. But, not psychology in the modern sense of, like, studying behavior or mental illness.
Right, not clinical psychology.
No, they began with pure consciousness and intelligence. They investigated mental states as the primary reality of the entire universe.
Wow. So everything else is secondary.
Yes. In their view, the physical body is merely an instrument. It's an organ shaped for the express purpose of manifesting those internal conscious states in a lower dimension.
So the physical form is the result, like the trailing edge of a comet.
That's a great image. The consciousness is the cause and the body is the effect.
Let's use the analogy she provides in the text because I think it makes this deductive approach so much clearer for you guys listening. The tree analogy.
Oh, the tree analogy is brilliant.
Right. If an ancient scientist from this tradition wants to understand a tree, they don't start by measuring the bark.
No, they look at the seed.
Exactly. But more specifically, they look at the invisible fundamental life principles at work deep within that seed.
The hidden potential.
Yes. And from understanding that unseen essence, they deduce how those principles will eventually manifest outward into the physical world.
They deduce the whole structure.
Right. How those invisible forces will dictate the shape of the root, the thickness of the trunk, the spread of the branches, and finally, the veins in the leaves.
They study the core, unified life force in its indefinite expansion into the many. They start at the invisible center and just work their way out to the physical perimeter.
Working from the inside out again.
Exactly. And the only way they could do this is because in antiquity, religion and science were never divorced.
They weren't fighting each other.
No, they weren't seen as opposing forces or even separate disciplines at all.
This is such a critical point to understand their mindset. The text emphasizes that every temple was a school,
Every temple.
and every priest was, by definition, a teacher of science. But there was a catch, wasn't there?
A huge catch. To even hope to become a sage, to be a scientist in this ancient tradition, you first had to be a saint.
A saint. Think about that requirement today.
Right. The purification of the self, the moral and spiritual elevation of the individual, was an absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for understanding the mechanics of the universe.
Because if the primary instrument you're using to observe the universe is your own consciousness.
Then that instrument must be flawless.
Exactly. If your mind is clouded by greed or anger or ego, your observations of the universe will literally be distorted.
It's like looking through a dirty microscope lens.
That's a perfect modern equivalent. The text talks about the Brahmanas in India, the teaching caste, and how they were revered above even kings.
Oh, the contrast there is amazing.
It describes this scenario where a ruler, clad in gold and jewels, would bow humbly to a half-naked, learned teacher living out in the forest.
Because that level of reverence was solely for knowledge. It had nothing to do with material wealth or physical power.
And they categorized this knowledge very specifically, too.
No.
There was the lower science, the Epravidya.
Yes, the lower science.
And this included things we might actually recognize today, right? Grammar, astronomy, poetry, the study of rituals.
Things you study in a university.
Exactly. And you could spend patient years mastering those, and they were considered valuable. But they were still just the lower science.
Just the basics.
The higher science, the Paravidya, was entirely different. The text says that even if you spent a lifetime, you might only learn its alphabet.
Because the higher science was the knowledge of the heart of all, the true self. To know the supreme being, the eternal.
That was the goal.
To know the self was true knowledge, and compared to that, literally everything else, all the astronomy and grammar in the world, was ultimately considered just form of ignorance.
Wow. So the ultimate triumph of human intelligence in the East was not inventing a new machine. It was knowing God.
That was the pinnacle.
Now, I want you to hold that deeply integrated, reverent approach in your mind, and let's contrast it with the origins of what the text calls modern science, or the science of the later West.
Get ready for whiplash.
Seriously, because the origin story of our modern scientific method is incredibly traumatic by comparison.
It really is a dark history. The text traces the roots of modern Western science to southern Spain, specifically Andalusia. It was brought into Europe by the schools of the Moors and the Arabians.
Okay, so it enters Europe.
And immediately upon its arrival, there is this profound existential conflict.
Right, because it didn't grow up peacefully inside the temples like it did in India. It was grafted onto Christendom, arriving in the wake of conquering Islamic armies.
The context was war.
Exactly. So right from the start, the European religious establishment viewed this new science as a blasphemy. It was literally viewed as an intellectual weapon forged by the enemy to destroy the faith.
The author paints a very grim but historically accurate picture of this friction. She notes that religion seized, imprisoned, tortured, and burned science.
Literally burned scientists at the stake.
Yes. And science, forced into a corner, having to fight for its very life, just for air to breathe, for ground to live on, struck back with ever-growing force at the religion that was actively trying to slay it.
That historical trauma completely defines the modern scientific mindset, doesn't it?
It's the foundational wound of modern science.
Science was born in a state of warfare. It had to reject the invisible, the spiritual, and the philosophical, because the institutions that represented the spiritual were lighting the match at the stake.
They had to stick to what they could prove.
Right. Science had to plant its flag purely in the physical, measurable world just to survive.
Which perfectly explains why its methodology is the exact opposite of the ancient science, if we go back to the tree analogy.
Right. How does the modern scientist study the tree?
They reverse the ancient method entirely. The modern scientist begins at the leaves.
Working from the outside in.
Exactly. They observe the shape, they measure the chlorophyll, they dissect a leaf under a microscope, then they move inward from the leaf to the twig, from the twig to the branch, from the branch down to the trunk, and eventually they might dig up the rootlets.
They study the medis in their indefinite branches to try and piece together a theory of the one.
It is purely inductive.
Purely inductive. They start with the physical, observable forms. They study physiology first. They dissect the body. They map the nervous system. They weigh the brain.
They measure how fast a nerve wave travels when a physical stimulus is applied.
Right. And on that purely physical, biological basis, they try to build up a theory of psychology and consciousness.
Because to the staunch materialist of the 19th century, consciousness is just the humming of the engine.
The humming of the engine, I like that.
It's just the result of nervous activity. They believe consciousness cannot be considered apart from the physical body. If you destroy the body, the consciousness ceases to exist, just like a flame goes out when the candle melts.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because if we look closely at how these two sciences operate, a major logistical question comes up.
A huge one.
Modern science is defined by observation of the physical world, looking at leaves, dissecting twigs, measuring nerve waves. And they achieve this by continuously building better external tools. Right?
Yes, technology.
We invent microscopes, then electron microscopes, then the James Webb Space Telescope. We build machines to see what our eyes cannot.
Right.
But ancient science is deductive. They are studying the invisible life principles. They are studying the one. If they didn't have microscopes back in ancient India or Atlantis, how did they observe anything beyond what the naked eye could see?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, how did they study the invisible mechanics of the universe without modern technology?
That is the pivotal question of the entire text, and Besant's answer is really the absolute core of occult philosophy.
Okay, what's our answer?
Well, when a modern scientist reaches the physical limit of their eyesight, they rely on metallurgy and glassmaking to devise a new instrument, right? A finer lens.
Right, they build a better tool.
But when the ancient scientists reached the limits of their physical observation, they didn't look outside themselves to build a machine.
They didn't?
No, they turned inward and proceeded to enlarge their limits by evolving new capacities within themselves.
Wait, they evolved the observer rather than the instrument.
Precisely. The text states that where modern science forced matter into fresh forms to make a delicate balance or a sharp lens, ancient science forced spirit to unfold new powers.
Unfold new powers.
It called upon the self to put forth increased energies. This was what she calls the secret of the East.
So it wasn't just magic tricks.
No, through rigorous esoteric teachings, deep meditation, and that intense purification we talked about earlier, they systematically developed their own internal latent capacities.
They basically biohacked their own consciousness.
Essentially, yeah. They built inner organs of perception to observe realms of existence that are entirely invisible to the normal physical eye.
So to the ancient mind, the universe isn't just mostly empty space.
Not at all.
It is teeming with life, with forces, and with subtle matter that we simply lack the sensory organs to perceive. For now, at least.
For now, exactly.
And that brings us to a really fascinating junction. Because if this ancient, deductive, self-evolving science had the ability to peer into the invisible scaffolding of the universe, how did they explain the actual physical beginning of the human race?
Right, getting back to the origin story.
Because if you throw out Darwin's primordial soup, what replaces it?
Well, what replaces it is significantly more cosmic and, frankly, much stranger to a modern ear.
Okay, brace yourselves.
To understand the origins of the individual, Besant asks us to go back to a time when the human race was evolving, but the individual human being as we know it, like a self-conscious thinker, had not yet come into existence.
So pre-human humans.
We have to look at what theosophical literature calls the first race of man.
Right, and I know we are keeping an open mind here on this deep dive, but this is where the text introduces a concept that sounds absolutely absurd at first glance.
It does, it really does.
It claims that the very first matrix, the original blueprint for humanity on Earth, was provided by entities called the lunar pitris.
Yes, the lunar pitris.
Pitris essentially translates to ancestors, right? So we were talking about ancestors from the moon.
Moon ancestors.
How does she possibly justify moon ancestors to a formal audience in 1913 without getting laughed out of the room?
It does sound like pure mythology or, early science fiction. But what's interesting is she doesn't defend it with mysticism. She actually defends it by asking the audience to look at undeniable physiological facts.
Okay, what?
She points out the constant causal relation between the moon and the Earth. Even millions of years into our evolution, long past our supposed origins, the moon still strictly measures out time for all great physiological periods on Earth.
Right. I mean, the tides of the oceans are the most obvious example of that.
Exactly.
But it's also deeply tied to biology, too. Reproductive cycles, certain growth cycles in plants and animals. The moon's gravitational and energetic influence is baked into the very biology of this planet. It is a celestial metronome.
It really is. So the text argues that if you recognize that deeply ingrained, undeniable physiological connection, a connection that even modern science accepts, it shouldn't be dismissed as mere superstition when ancient books claim there is a causal ancestral relation between forms of living beings that once existed on the lunar globe in ages past and the humanity developing here on Earth.
Okay, so she's saying the moon isn't just a rock pulling water, it's our ancestral home in a previous evolutionary cycle.
That's the occult claim, yes.
So let's walk through the mechanics of this because it's pretty wild. The text specifies we were in the 4th round of planetary evolution, kind of skipping the first 3 for the sake of time.
Right, skipping ahead.
When these lunar pitris, these moon ancestors, came to Earth, they didn't arrive in spaceships and drop off physical bodies, did they?
No, no spaceships.
The text says they projected their astral forms. They threw out shadows or ethereal bodies.
Yes. And this is a massive concept in occult science. The idea that you must build the ethereal body first.
Before the physical one.
Exactly. The text makes a rigorous, almost physics-based argument for why an ethereal body, a body made of finer astral matter, had to exist in point of time before the dense physical body we possess today could ever be formed.
Let's break down that argument because I think it actually makes a weird kind of logical sense if you accept the underlying premise.
It does have its own internal logic.
Right. So the author points out that life relies on vital energies. You cannot have life phenomena. You can't have chemical action without electrical or magnetic currents.
Which is scientifically true.
And you cannot have electrical or magnetic currents without the presence of an underlying medium. In the science of her day, that medium was called ether.
Right, the luminiferous ether.
Therefore, it is literally impossible for dense physical molecules to just randomly draw themselves together to make a functioning body unless you first have a matrix of ether for those vital magnetic forces to operate through.
Because otherwise, what's holding it all together?
Exactly. It's like trying to build a house by just dumping a massive truckload of bricks onto a vacant lot and hoping they organize themselves into walls.
Which they won't.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
You need scaffolding. You need mortar. You need a structural frame. The physical molecules need something to hold them together and guide their placement.
A blueprint.
Right. The text states that every single physical molecule has its own envelope of ether and is totally permeated by it. The ethereal envelope is what allows the life forces to draw the physical molecules together and hold the physical body in shape.
So according to this timeline, during the first and second races of man, there was no dense physical flesh at all.
Just ethereal shadows.
Right. The physical body was slowly, painstakingly built up around this ethereal matrix over millions of years. And importantly, it wasn't a process of random genetic mutation.
It wasn't blind chance.
No, it was actively guided by entities the text calls nature spirits.
I love that term, nature spirits.
It's very evocative.
They act as the cosmic architects, or maybe the cosmic bricklayers. They take the ethereal blueprint provided by the lunar pitris, and they slowly gather the dense physical matter of Earth to build the outer clothing of man, the tabernacle of flesh, as she calls it.
A tabernacle.
So out of the first race evolved the second, and from the second evolved the third. It is sequential evolution, but it is guided from within and from above, not driven by blind environmental chance.
And this entire process of the ethereal blueprint gathering physical matter perfectly illustrates a foundational philosophical concept in this text: the pairs of opposites.
The pairs of opposites, let's dig into that.
If you go right back to the beginning of manifestation to what they term the second logos, it is essentially spirit matter.
Hyphenated.
Hyphenated, exactly. These are the two great poles of existence between which all organization, all life takes place.
Let's dissect those two poles because it really redefines how we think about creation.
Okay, so one pole is active, positive, and gives the impulse. That is spirit.
The active driver.
Yes. You might call it the father in physical nature. The other pole is passive, negative, and its purpose is to be receptive and give form. That is matter, or the mother.
The mother.
These two are absolutely inseparable everywhere in nature. Without the union of the stimulating force, the father, and the receptive form that develops around it, the mother, you will find nowhere fresh growth or progress in evolution.
And this is where the occult view entirely upends standard biology. In standard biology, we think of evolution from the bottom up, right?
Almost entirely bottom up.
Cells divide, a random mutation occurs, and if the environment doesn't kill the mutated creature, it survives. The form is an accident of survival.
A lucky mistake.
Right. But this text suggests top-down design. The form, the ethereal, astral matrix, was designed and projected first by the lunar pitris. It was a perfect template.
The intention was already there.
And on the passive side, the physical matter was gathered into that template, guided by nature spirits, animated by the active impulse of spirit.
The intention preceded the physical reality.
But if we follow this logic, we run into a major problem, don't we?
Oh, definitely.
We have an ethereal form. We have physical matter drawn into it to create a dense body. We have this perfect tabernacle of flesh. But a physical body that just sits there, even if it's perfectly formed and its heart is beating, isn't really a human being.
No, it's basically a biological statue.
Right. It doesn't think. It doesn't feel. How does this ancient science explain the jump to actual consciousness? How do we go from a biological machine to a being that actually experiences the world?
That gap in the logic brings us to the development of what the text calls the germ of consciousness.
The germ of consciousness.
We've passed through the first and second races. Now, as the third race was evolving over incalculable periods of time, a massive internal development took place. The physical and astral bodies were already constructed, but now a third element begins to develop: the body of sensation.
The body of sensation. And the text uses a specific Sanskrit word for this, assuming her audience of esoteric students will recognize it. Kama.
Kama, yes.
Which translates to the desire body.
Exactly. It is the part of our constitution, and the text explicitly notes it's a part we share entirely with the lower animals, that receives contacts from the external universe and translates them into feeling.
The translation aspect is the key there, isn't it? Let's think about how sight works purely physically.
Okay.
Light waves bounce off an object, they travel through the air, they hit your cornea, they vibrate the physical ether on your retina, and a nerve impulse travels to your brain.
That's the physics of it.
Right, that is all physical mechanics. But a nerve impulse is just a tiny electrical charge. It isn't an image. It isn't the feeling of seeing the color red or recognizing a face.
Right, it doesn't have meaning on its own.
Exactly. The physical organ itself doesn't feel. It just vibrates.
And Besant points out that there is a profound break, a completely inexplicable gap in materialistic science between the outer physical impact on the nervous system and the internal subjective experience we call sight or pain.
Science still struggles with that today, the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. Materialism can trace the vibration right up to the brain cells, but it cannot explain how a vibrating brain cell magically turns into a conscious thought.
It's like magic to them.
In this occult framework, though, that power of seeing, tasting, smelling, feeling, all those subjective experiences actually reside in this third body, the kama body, the desire body.
So the physical body just catches the vibration and passes it inward to the kama body, which then translates it into actual sensation.
Precisely.
And we see this clearly in the animal kingdom, right? Animals have this kama body just as we do. They exhibit the full range of emotions, passions, and appetites.
Oh, absolutely.
You see anger in a dog whose bone is taken away. You see sex, passion, hunger, thirst, fear.
Sure, kama.
But, and this is crucial, the text argues that in this raw animal desire, in this kama, lies the very root of what will eventually become self-consciousness.
So let's trace how that root grows. Consciousness, in its absolute most primitive germ form, is simply the power to respond to a vibration coming from the outside.
Like a reflex.
Right. A rock doesn't really respond, an amoeba does. It recoils from a toxic drop of water. But when that physical power of response has feeling added to it, when the creature doesn't just recoil mechanically but actually feels pain, then you get what the text calls the germ of mind.
It's not a full reasoning logical mind yet, though, is it?
No, not at all.
It's just the negative receptive side of mind.
Yeah.
It is the fertile soil in which a true mind can eventually take root.
And to make this abstract evolution of the mind concrete, Besant provides a brilliant observable analogy.
I love her analogies.
She compares a wild animal to a domesticated one.
I think this is one of the strongest arguments in the text, because you can literally see it happening in real time.
You really can.
If you look at a wild animal, say a wolf that has never interacted with humans, you see plenty of response to external impacts. It sees a rabbit, it feels the comic craving for food, it moves toward the rabbit.
Pure stimulus and reaction.
Right. It is pure stimulus and immediate reaction. You find very little complex reasoning. There's very little linking together of an inner sensation with an outer object, unless that object is physically right in front of its nose.
But what happens when you domesticate an animal over generations?
Everything changes.
What happens when the wolf becomes the dog? The text argues that you hand down a very definite heredity, not just in the physical shape of the dog, but in their astral and comic bodies as well.
You are literally training and evolving their emotional body through repeated domesticity, through the constant daily interaction with the more evolved, complex mind of the human. The germ of mind in the animal is stimulated to develop exponentially faster than it would in the wild,
The human's higher vibration pulls the animal's lower vibration upward.
which serves as a perfect microcosm for how the ego, or the infant human soul, learns in its earliest stages.
Right, moving from the animal to the human.
To explain the birth of human experience and memory, the text shifts from the animal analogy to a historical one. It looks at Aboriginal peoples, whom the text refers to using the standard parlance of its time as savages, to illustrate a mind that is still living entirely in the present moment, just barely above the animal state.
The example given is striking, and it really helps crystallize exactly how memory is born. She says, imagine an individual living completely in the immediate present.
Just reacting to right now.
Exactly. It's a cold morning. If you give them a blanket, they will eagerly wrap themselves in it because the cold is an immediate physical want. The stimulus is there, the reaction is there.
Makes perfect sense.
But by noon, the sun is blazing hot. They no longer want the blanket. In fact, it's a heavy, sweaty burden.
So what do?
They throw it away, perhaps trading it for a shiny bauble or just leaving it on the ground.
And why do they do that? Because, as the text explains, they have not yet sufficiently developed the concept of invariable sequence in their minds.
Variable sequence.
They lack the cognitive architecture to project into the future and realize that night will inevitably come back, the temperature will drop, and the blanket they're throwing away now will be desperately needed in 12 hours.
Besant uses a wonderfully poetic phrase here. The sunset of yesterday is a past incarnation to them.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Isn't it? Their consciousness does not carry the memory through the night. This is the illustration of the baby sense of the ego.
So the question becomes, how does this baby ego learn? How does it evolve past living only in the exact present second?
Well, through the blunt force trauma of pleasure and pain.
Literally.
Yes. As this baby ego moves out into an unknown world and constantly contacts objects, the universe literally divides itself into two massive binary categories.
The first great division in human thought, right? Things it wants and things it does not want.
Exactly. Things get labeled in the primitive mind. Category A, pleasure. This felt good. To be sought, to be followed.
And category B, painful. This burned, this hurt, to be avoided, to be run away from, to be escaped.
That binary is the very beginning of human experience. The ego begins to remember, fire burned me yesterday. I will avoid the fire today.
Or, that fruit tasted sweet. I will seek that tree again.
Right. It learns that the world has rules, it is a definite kind of thing, and the ego has to accommodate itself to it to survive.
But just learning to chase pleasure and run from pain is still basically just animal behavior equipped with a slightly better memory.
It's essentially Pavlovian.
Right. To become truly fully human, another massive evolutionary leap is required. We need a higher mind. And this is where the text introduces the concept of the sons of mind.
These entities are also referred to as the Kumaras, meaning youths, or the solar Pitras.
Contrasting with the lunar pictures from earlier, the moon ancestors.
Exactly. According to esoteric tradition, in past universes, in previous cycles of existence, these entities had already fully developed their minds and passed into nirvana.
They'd already graduated.
Yes. But at the beginning of this present age, they descended.
It's the descent of spirit again, involution happening at a higher level.
Exactly. They are the advanced, higher minds that eventually impress themselves upon this lower tabernacle, this body of flesh and desire that has been slowly built up over millions of years. The thinker, the God in man, finally descends into the biological vessel.
And this God in man has a dual aspect, right?
It does.
One face is turned constantly upward toward the divine, its source. But the other face is turned downward toward matter, toward the kama body, to dominate it, subdue it, and extract experience from it. It's the higher rational mind uniting with the lower animal soul.
And that union turns the entire life of man into a battlefield.
A literal war zone inside us.
Yes. It is the gods struggling with the brute inside the exact same skin in order that the brute itself may eventually become divine through that very friction.
It is such a deeply hopeful view of humanity, Especially when you consider all our historical flaws and brutal tendencies.
It's very optimistic.
When Besant gave this address in Chicago, she actually looked at the audience and challenged them. She said, "Do you doubt that God is in every man?" She acknowledges that it's super easy to be cynical. People constantly talk of their own race as corrupt, and many religious faiths at the time ascribed an inherently evil, completely depraved character to humanity.
Original sin, basically.
Right. But she argues that if you truly believe the very heart of man is light, then you can appeal to that divine spark even in the lowest, most degraded conditions.
And she gives a very grounded, almost heartbreaking example to prove her point here.
She does. She draws on the English mining villages of her time.
She paints a picture of villages located far away from the ordinary cultured haunts of men, places that were once beautiful nature but have been utterly defaced by industrial greed and carelessness.
Just covered in soot.
Exactly. Villages where the workers lives at the absolute lowest, most degraded, brutal level, just endless toil, darkness, and basic survival.
But even there, in that grime and misery, she asserts the divine spirit has its sanctuary in the innermost heart of those people. She argues that you will find acts of incredible self-sacrifice and heroism in those mines, miners literally risking their lives for their brothers when there's a cave-in.
Yes. And through slow progression, life after life, the individual evolves. The lower mind aspires upward to the higher mind, stimulated by these acts of sacrifice.
Until finally, after countless cycles, there comes a time when the individual consciously sets a definite aim.
The ultimate turning point.
The human being vows themselves to the true, ultimate goal in life, the service of their race and the giving of themselves for man. That self-sacrifice is the absolute apex of human evolution, according to this occult framework.
It's a breathtaking scope when you lay it all out like that. We went from a lunar ethereal shadow to a creature of raw sensation, to a baby ego learning pleasure and pain, to a violent battlefield of spirit and brute, and finally to a self-conscious being dedicated entirely to serving humanity.
It is a stunning, epic narrative. But here is where we kind of had to pivot the discussion.
Oh, this is the fun part.
Yeah, this is where the text gets incredibly spicy and combative. Because as human minds evolved and grew more sophisticated, they naturally began studying their own origins. But according to Annie Besant, the rigid modern science of the 19th century, the inductive science we discussed earlier, fell into several massive fundamental misconceptions that desperately needed correcting.
And these weren't just minor errors she's pointing out. These were the prevailing scientific dogmas of the time.
The unquestionable truths.
Right. The things that were considered absolute, unshakable truths by the materialist thinkers of the late 1800s. And Besant just takes them apart systematically, using their own scientific discoveries against them.
Let's look at misconception 1. The belief that life is a product of dead matter.
Okay.
The idea that life is just a happy, accidental byproduct of chemistry.
For a long time, early scientists firmly believed there was a fundamental, impenetrable barrier between organic and inorganic chemistry.
They thought they were two totally different universes.
Exactly. They observed that certain compounds were only found as the products of living vegetables and animals.
Therefore, they concluded that these specific compounds were the exclusive outcome of living energy. And conversely, if you couldn't find them in the mineral kingdom, they belonged to a totally separate category of existence.
Right.
But then, as chemistry advanced, they made a massive reductionist leap of logic. They decided that since life processes involved chemical reactions, life itself must just be an outcome of chemical agencies.
They decided that life was just a side effect of electricity and chemicals reacting in a puddle.
But the text points out how this materialist argument was completely destroyed by the chemists themselves, ironically.
Oh, totally. In the laboratory, as modern chemistry advanced, scientists succeeded in synthesizing those very organic bodies, the ones previously thought to only come from living things, out of pure inorganic materials.
They broke down the barrier. They made the organic compounds synthetically, and initially the materialists cheered.
They thought they had won.
They threw a parade. They said, see, you don't need a supreme source of life. You don't need God or a spirit. We made it in a lab with dead chemicals. Life is just chemical energy.
But Besant brilliantly turns this around on them. She says science is now forced to admit that life shows specific energies that completely differentiate it from mere electrical and chemical affinities.
Just having the chemicals isn't enough.
Right. The phenomena of living things possess energies like growth, adaptation, and reproduction that science simply cannot trace back to basic chemical sources. Just because you can synthesize the chemical makeup of a leaf doesn't mean you can synthesize the life force that grows the tree.
Exactly. And even more profoundly, the text brings up the concept of atomic evolution.
Atomic evolution, yes.
It argues that the atom itself is not a piece of dead, static matter. The atom is a living thing. It possesses an inner evolution, changing its combining power to form complicated combinations that are never found in the simple mineral kingdom.
So instead of life being an accidental byproduct of dead matter, the text argues that chemistry is actually proving that the universe is permeated entirely by universal life.
Life is everywhere.
Yes, that what we call dead matter is actually pulsating with life and progressing through its own slow evolution. The ancient rishis of India, who claimed everything was alive, weren't dreaming. Modern chemistry, by proving atoms evolve and combine, was inadvertently proving the ancients right.
Which brings us to misconception two, and honestly, this one is my favorite because the historical quote she uses to illustrate it is just so aggressively blunt.
I know exactly which one you mean.
The 19th century scientific belief that the brain produces thought.
Yes. The purely mechanical view of consciousness.
Right. As the method of physiological experiment yielded more and more results like mapping the nerves, finding the speech center of the brain scientists began to think that psychology could only be understood by studying the physical nervous mechanism.
They truly believed that analyzing the physical meat of the brain would fully explain the abstract nature of the mind.
Which is quite a leap.
It is. And this led to some incredibly rash, overconfident statements. The text calls out a famous German physiologist named Carl Vogt.
Vogt is the one who famously, or rather infamously, declared that the brain produced thought as the liver produced bile.
As the liver produces bile.
I mean, it is the most extreme reductionist statement imaginable.
It really is.
You eat a sandwich, your liver secretes bile to digest it. You read a philosophical book, your brain secretes a thought to process it. It reduces the highest aspirations of humanity, our art, our love, our spiritual seeking, to a literal bodily secretion.
And the text completely and utterly refutes this. It positions the brain not as the creator of thought, but merely as the machinery, the physical instrument for it.
The hardware, basically.
Exactly. The consciousness exists outside the brain and uses the brain to manipulate the physical body. And to prove this point, she brings in some very interesting counterarguments from other scientists of the era, specifically mentioning Lombroso and Dr. Maudsley.
Right. These were doctors studying what they termed abnormal brains. Geniuses, visionaries, people who saw things others didn't.
People outside the norm.
And the text asks a brilliant, challenging question. Is there any law of nature that says the perfect brain, the one deemed normal, healthy, and average by societal standards, is the only one capable of higher performances?
The argument she makes is that the normal brain, the one produced by millions of years of past physical evolution, is perfectly fitted for the ordinary affairs of life.
Paying taxes, running from tigers.
Exactly. It's a great machine for the calculations of the marketplace, for observing material threats, for finding food, for carrying on daily survival. It is the best possible machinery for that specific, grounded work.
But when you come to deal with higher thought, with profound spiritual insights or staggering creative genius, maybe that normal, well-adjusted brain isn't fitted for the task.
Maybe it's too rigid.
Right. Maybe the machinery needs to be altered or stretched, or even what medical science might diagnose as abnormal, in order to catch those much higher, finer vibrations of the spirit.
The author asks a rhetorical question. What does it matter if the medical establishment calls their brains normal or abnormal, if in their consciousness we can see a ray of the divine splendor?
And then she drops this absolutely beautiful quote from the poet Robert Browning to really hammer the point home.
Oh, please read it.
I have to. Through such souls alone, God, stooping, shows sufficient of his light for us in the dark to rise by.
It's a profound reframing of how we view genius and mysticism. If it takes a brain change from a normal to an abnormal state to receive that divine light, then humanity must ever remain thankful to that abnormality.
It flips the medical diagnosis on its head.
It completely destroys the materialist idea that a mechanically perfect brain is the pinnacle of human existence. The brain doesn't secrete the light, it's just a lens trying to catch it.
And sometimes a slightly warped lens catches a much broader, more spectacular spectrum of light.
A warped lens catching a broader spectrum. That is a brilliant way to look at it.
And, it brings us to the climax of this entire journey, because we've spent this time setting up these two vastly opposing forces. Ancient science, looking at the invisible, the spiritual, the internal, the deductive.
Right.
And modern science, born in rebellion, focusing only on the physical, the tangible, the external, the inductive.
But here is where history takes a truly thrilling turn. By the turn of the 20th century, right around the time this book was published, modern science, by following its own incredibly strict materialistic path, was suddenly hitting a wall.
Or rather, it was crossing a threshold.
Exactly. Their own rigid experiments were forcing them, against their will, into the realm of the invisible.
They couldn't avoid it anymore.
No. The text charts this ascent beautifully. Modern science climbed slowly upwards, demanding proof for every single step. They observed, weighed, and tested solids.
Right. The things they could hold.
Once they mastered solids, they developed tools to measure liquids. Then they moved to gases. They mastered all the tangible physical states of matter.
But at the very last step, science finds itself in a region where matter suddenly fails to respond to their physical scales and their glass microscopes.
The physical world becomes intangible. It becomes imponderable.
And yet they know this intangible substance must be present. Because without an intangible medium, the workings of mighty energies, like light waves, magnetism, electricity, are completely unintelligible.
They couldn't explain how magnetic forces or light could travel through the empty vacuum of space. There had to be a medium carrying the wave.
So science is forced by its own mathematics to formulate the existence of this intangible, imponderable matter. They called it the ether.
And suddenly, modern science has stepped into the exact same territory that ancient science had been occupying for millennia.
It is the ultimate convergence. Ancient science started with life and intelligence at the top and traced it down as it clothed itself in denser and denser matter until it reached the ether.
And modern science started with rocks and solids at the bottom and climbed up through gases until it reached the ether. They met in the middle.
And the text provides some absolutely staggering examples of cutting-edge science from 1913 that were actively vindicating ancient occult claims. Let's look at the first one, X-rays.
Discovered by Roentgen, X-rays proved to the materialists that there are vibrations in the ether that can pass straight through solid matter that we previously considered completely opaque.
Which blew your minds.
The text marvels at the new ability to enable a photograph to be taken of a skeleton within a living body, or finding a bullet embedded in an internal organ without cutting the person open.
Now, why does this matter to the occultist? Because for thousands of years, esoteric traditions had talked about dark light or invisible light that could penetrate matter.
And scientists had called them crazy, superstitious fools.
Right. Then Dr. Le Bon publishes a scientific monograph in 1900 about his experiments with what he literally named La Lumière invisible light. The ancient mystical assertion was suddenly verified by a modern apparatus plugged into a wall.
Then there's the development of wireless telegraphy.
Radio.
Yes. Ancient science always asserted that etheric vibrations could be utilized for communication without employing physical apparatus connecting the 2 points. They claimed you didn't need a physical bridge to send a message.
Which, again, sounded like magic to a 19th century scientist who was busy laying thousands of miles of copper telegraph wire across the ocean floor.
Right. But then Jagadish Chandra Bose and Guglielmo Marconi come along and practically prove it with electrical vibrations. Wireless telegraphy becomes an established scientific fact. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ether itself suffices as a medium of communication between widely separated points.
Which leads directly to the most controversial, but to the author, the most logical next step. Thought transference or telepathy.
Oh, this was a massive leap for them.
The text points out that for a long time, if you spoke to a man of science about thought transference, you were immediately called a crank or a fraud.
Because it's often easier for the establishment to call someone a fraud than to admit their own ignorance. The text doesn't pull punches there. The ignorant who are not able to understand nearly always call out fraud when confronted with phenomena that break their established rules.
But the logic is inescapable, really. Because wireless telegraphy proved that invisible electrical waves can travel through the ether and be picked up by a receiver. The transmission of thought waves, which they posited were just a finer type of vibration, through the ether was proved to be theoretically possible.
And its actuality was being asserted not just by mystics, but by eminent, highly respected scientists of the day, like Sir William Crookes and Professor Oliver Lodge.
The old teachers in the forest, the ancient books which stated that action at a distance is a reality of the mind, were being mathematically and experimentally justified by the later investigations of the 19th and 20th centuries.
To really hammer home how this is mechanically possible, we have to share the analogy from Professor Crookes that the author includes.
It is the absolute perfect way to visualize this convergence of The seen and the unseen, the physical and the mystical.
The electrical machine analogy. It's brilliant. Let's walk through it.
Okay, imagine we are standing in a large room. And suppose, purely for the sake of the analogy, that human beings had no eyes to see light. We were entirely blind to light
Oh,
waves.
he's so we're blind.
But suppose we had developed an inner organ that answered perfectly to electrical vibrations.
Okay, so we can't see the light bulbs, but we can feel the electrical current humming in the wires.
Exactly. To us, without eyes, the room would appear completely pitch dark, even if it was flooded with intense light waves. Our consciousness simply doesn't have the receiver to perceive it.
We just don't have the hardware.
Right. But suppose a large electric machine was fixed at one end of the hall, and a strong electric current was sent rushing through the room.
We would perceive that instantly, because our hypothetical inner organ vibrates in answer to the electric current. The current reaches our consciousness through that specific tuned receiver.
Yes. The air would be opaque and dark to us regarding light, but we would be keenly, brilliantly aware of the electricity.
That's a great analogy.
The major takeaway here, as the text points out, is that consciousness is completely helpless without an organ that receives vibrations from without. The only way the body can receive and transfer any vibration to the inner intelligence is if it has built the right receiver.
And if we connect this analogy back to the massive overarching picture of evolution, of involution and evolution, the implication is staggering.
It really is.
As humanity continues to evolve, we are not just building better physical brains to do math or survive in the marketplace. We are literally slowly building the inner organs, the subtle astral and mental receivers necessary to perceive the invisible forces that ancient occultists have talked about for millennia.
We are building the internal antennas for telepathy, for seeing the ethereal matrix, for experiencing the higher mind. Evolution isn't finished. We are just under construction.
Exactly. The fundamental principles of ancient science were established by the experiences of highly developed individuals who had already put in the work to evolve those capacities ahead of the rest of us.
The trailblazers.
And the text claims these principles are always verifiable anew by anyone who puts in the esoteric work to develop those inherent capacities.
Just like becoming a theoretical physicist requires immense, focused effort that isn't practicable for everyone in their present life, right?
Exactly. Developing these occult capacities is basically the advanced coursework of human evolution.
Wow. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by reading dense esoteric philosophy or biology textbooks, I hope this deep dive has shown how beautifully these concepts can actually intertwine.
They really do complement each other in a strange way.
Let's synthesize this massive journey. Evolution, through the lens of Annie Besant and this 1913 text, isn't just a biological imperative. It is not a blind, accidental staggering from the mud to the monkey to the man.
No, it is a deliberate cosmic drama. It is the story of involution for spirit intentionally diving down into dense physical matter, providing the initial impulse and the ethereal blueprint for life.
It's the slow, arduous building of a sensory body, the karma, to translate physical impacts into pleasure and pain.
It's the gradual development of memory in the baby ego.
And eventually, it is the descent of the higher mind, turning the human being into a battlefield where the divine struggles to subdue the brute, all with the ultimate evolutionary goal of reuniting with the divine through the conscious, selfless service of humanity.
And the most beautiful part of this entire synthesis is how it reconciles the two warring factions of human thought.
It does. Whether you approach the mystery of life from the deductive, mystical, ancient schools of the East, looking inward to purify and expand the capacities of the self,
Or whether you approach it from the inductive, heavily instrumented modern schools of the West, looking outward, dissecting matter, and building finer and finer lenses.
both paths, if you pursue them relentlessly enough, eventually meet at the exact same point.
That both hit the ether.
They both converge on the undeniable reality of the invisible, interconnected forces of the universe.
The spiritual and the material are not enemies. They are just the two poles of the same existence, the father and the mother, the impulse and the form. You cannot have one without the other, and you cannot understand the universe by only looking at half of it.
So, to bring it all the way back to the beginning, we started by talking about the comfort of an X-ray, the deeply human desire for a clean, binary, black and white diagnosis of reality, broken or not broken.
But this deep dive shows us that reality and our history of trying to understand it is infinitely more layered, complex, and beautiful than a simple bone fracture on a screen.
Absolutely. The murky waters of consciousness and evolution aren't murky because they are chaotic. They are murky because they are dense with invisible forces. We are only just beginning to build the organs to perceive.
We are still growing our inner eyes.
Which leaves me with one final, lingering thought for you to mull over. If the cutting-edge science of 100 years ago, things like X-rays and wireless telegraphy, suddenly vindicated ancient mystical theories about invisible light and unseen connections.
What's next?
Exactly. What unexplainable so-called mystical phenomenon of today is just waiting for tomorrow's technology to prove it was a scientific reality all along? Keep digging, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.